weeks ago as the stay-at-home orders went into place. We started this platform to bring our industry community together on a daily basis to discuss important issues in the entertainment and digital industries. 2 weeks ago, we hosted a discussion on race at work in the entertainment industry as an open forum to listen and give support to all of our friends and colleagues, particularly to our Black friends and colleagues who have been and continue to be under attack in our country and workplaces subjected to racism, discrimination, and violence. Today is a continuation of the conversation we started 2 weeks ago. Today's topic, understanding white privilege, is one that makes some people uncomfortable, but is also sparking a lot of attention. When we announced the topic earlier this week, we received a lot of emails from people saying how grateful they were we've opened this business forum to a discussion on a topic like this. We also received a small number of angry, intimidating, and threatening messages from people who wanted to shut this down. They called us un-American and a lot of other things that I won't say on the air. I want to be crystal clear about a few things. No American is more American than any other, period. Two, Tinzar and I opened this platform to take on important and sometimes hard to tackle topics like this, and that's what we're going to do. Making threats and attempting to intimidate or silence others because of the topics we discuss, our skin color, sexual identity, or belief systems is not free expression and has no place here or in our society as a whole. Having conversations like this is what America is all about. Now, before I turn it over to our speaker to set the ground rules, we have a big group here for a meeting format. So we want to get everybody involved, and we're going to try to do that. So if you have questions, please send them to me through the DM. You can DM them to Ned Sherman. You can see my name there. And what I'll do is I'll start an order of people. And when we're able to take questions, we'll ask you to the stage and let you unmute your mic so that you can then ask your question or make your comment. We'd appreciate if you keep them kind of short so that we can keep the discussion going and get as many people into it as we can. Also, it's all right to give a little bit of background, but keep in mind that we just want to kind of keep this thing flowing, and we only have an hour here today. All right. Now let me introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to join all of you in the audience and help facilitate the questions and comments as they arise. Our first speaker is Jonathan Azu. Jonathan helped us create this platform 2 weeks ago and one of our speakers in our first segment. Jonathan is a two-time Billboard 40 Under 40 power player and founder of Culture Collective, a talent management company driving change within the music industry while also representing creatives who exemplify their cultures. His roster includes notable artists, including Anita Baker, Emily King, Corey Henry, Luke, Michelle Williams, Miguel, Kool and the Gang, Lecrae, Leon Thomas, and more. Joining Jonathan is diversity and inclusion speaker, facilitator, and author Tom Schweizer. Jonathan and Tom, thank you very much for joining the discussion today. I'm going to join the audience now and turn it over to you guys.
I appreciate it, Ned. Thanks a lot. A couple of weeks ago when we were doing the Race at Work format, I talked a little bit about how I had personally, as a Black executive, gotten to where I was at professionally and personally on the shoulders of many people that didn't look like me. And when I was in college, I was lucky enough to have Tom be one of those people. I used to intern for Tom, living in St. Louis in his previous life before taking steps into working on diversity and inclusion and social justice. He was the executive director of a festival and gave me the opportunity to intern there. And those are all little building blocks that helped lead me to where I'm at today. So this is definitely a full circle moment for me. I went to high school with Tom's kids. We haven't connected at this level in a long time, but I've followed his career from a distance. And when we were thinking through what we wanted to do as a follow-up, as we promised last 2 weeks ago, I thought what better opportunity than to again, go further on this topic of race as we all as a country and as our entertainment industry work towards steps to making it a better country. The goal of today, I really think, is to help people begin, or for some of you, further work towards unpacking what privilege is, how to see it, how to hear it, how to act on it, and different ways that we can use it to help take those steps towards a better community. Like I said last time, it's race is a complex conversation. I can't tell you that myself and others jump at the opportunity to talk about it at every moment, but it's tough, it's complex, but it's a conversation that needs to happen. Communication needs to happen. So I appreciate DEW and Ned and Tinzar for giving us this platform. Remember that, open and honest and respectful conversations is also a path. Things that are uncomfortable don't always mean that they're wrong. Uncomfortability can also mean that you're stepping towards the right direction. With that, again, the structure is going to be relatively loose. I have a couple questions for Tom, and then after that, we can open it up to general comments and other questions. So, Tom, very broad question, the first one, but from your professional opinion, what is white privilege?
White privilege is those unearned benefits and advantages that white people have just for the sake of being white. It's, I'm betting you would agree if we walked into the Gap, and I don't mean to pick on the Gap, or you and my daughter walked in, my daughter being white is going to get shopper attention, and you might be followed around by a work associate because they see a young black man coming in the store and they figure shoplifter. Those benefits, I was at one of the big stores recently, and as I was walking out, there was an African-American family in front of me, and the greeter stopped them and asked them for their receipt so he could check what was in their basket. And I've been in that store hundreds of times, and no one has ever asked me for my receipt to check in the basket. It's going to the store and writing a check and being asked for a second form of identification. It's our fathers and grandfathers coming out of World War II and receiving GI, if you're white, receiving GI benefits to go to school and buy homes. But if you're black, being denied the college because schools had quotas in those days, and apply for a loan only if it's in a redlined area. So this white privilege has permeated our society from the very beginning, but it has built a huge gap in so many areas between white people and people of color.
What's interesting is, and I've always said that those, some of those examples, the GI Bill are from years ago, there are small elements that manifest themselves across decades and decades, and then they really surface in everyday life. And in our industry, the entertainment industry, I've never, in people I've worked with, I've never thought that that the majority would think that things that are going on right now, the acute things such as the George Floyd situation or the unfortunate situation in Atlanta, are right. And somebody had mentioned this term to me, white progressive privilege, and they had described it as that person that may put the Black Lives Matter poster in the window, right? But on Monday morning, they tend to maybe subconsciously lean to their comfort that they've developed over decades, and that's what they use to make decisions in a position of power. And to me, that's the most damaging and problematic one as it relates to our country, and also as it relates to our industry, is that implicit versus explicit racism that manifests itself all around.
Yeah. You said it's so easy to go back. Well, in my case, I've been trained for 70 years to accept these benefits and easily rely on them. And it takes a great amount. The first thing you have to do is breathe and recognize something's going on. The second thing is be mindful and of what is going on in your world and how those benefits affect you, and how they affect the Schweizer family as opposed to the Azu family. And it comes everywhere. It's so ingrained in our life. I've noticed, I've been in a coffee shop and there was a African-American woman about my age waiting for coffee, and I walked up and the clerk immediately turned their attention to me and just totally ignored this poor lady. And it's so easy to ignore that and not bear witness. And so first thing you got to do is look for those situations where your privilege is benefiting from you, and then work on, and it takes a time to the point where you can call that barista in or call that clerk at the store in and have a discussion with them about what is happening. But first, relax, breathe, and then become mindful of what you are witnessing and participating in.
Great advice. I'd like to open it up to the forum for comments, questions, and we'll continue to build on those comments and questions.
Okay, I think we have Jeffrey Stansfield would like to ask a question. He has his hand up here. Can we invite Jeffrey to unmute?
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for this get together. One of the issues that I have is, during the I'm also in the entertainment industry, and all the studios are now requiring sensitivity training, not just but racial, but gender sensitivity training. And the problem that I have, and I'm not sure if anybody else has had this problem, I sell equipment to Disney, and Disney has a list of approved sensitivity training companies that they charge $500 or $600, whatever they charge. But then I also deal with NBC Universal, and they have a list, and their list is not the same list as Disney. So now I have to take the class twice. And now I'm dealing with Fox. Now I have to take the class 3 times. Right now, I have to take the class 12 times and pay $500 to $600 per class. Now, I have no problem taking the class. I have no problem sending my staff to take the class. But if I have to pay $500 or $600 times 12 to learn the same thing over and over again, it becomes very, very stressful, because I'm a small business, and it is a big impact to it. I'm wondering if other people have had this kind of thing and what people are doing to take sensitivity training. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks for the question. And it's interesting because I felt like maybe not this same example of a vendor requiring sensitivity training, but I feel like, especially over the last 2 weeks, that a lot of companies have put perceived solutions in place, and leapfrogged talking about the issue within their own 4 walls, right? So, because one could go to sensitivity training, they could, buy a book, but or cut a check, which has been a very popular thing the last couple of weeks. Send the money out and then dedicate a day, Juneteenth, in solidarity. But there's a lot in between there. So I don't know if I can necessarily, give comments as it relates to the particular situation with NBC and CBS and whatnot. But ultimately, I think that as a small business owner, there's a lot that we can do between recognizing that there's issues, right, and how to make sure those don't manifest within your own business place, to spending money and actually deploying sensitivity training. I'm a small business owner too. I got a phone call from a small business owner right when this all happened. It was a white small business owner manager. And he was asking me, what he can do, that he was actually getting ready to hire somebody. And he had caught himself in the midst of all what's happening in this country saying, I automatically defaulted to, let me just hire within my own network. Let me just find somebody that I went to, that I've worked with in the past or went to camp with. I think that's what he said. And that's how I'll find my hire, instead of thinking out of the box about, let me make sure I look at a diversified set of employees. And my comment to him was, you think he has 4 employees, is that, if you're able to make that hire, make that difference, that represents a large percentage of your workforce, right? Which statistically means that you're moving in the right direction. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. And let me add, and I'm sorry you have to pay all that money for those sessions. And, very typical, they're a 2-hour session. And as I said, I've been trained for 70 years in our society, and a 2-hour training, even if you take it 12 times, isn't going to do something. I encourage organizations to form a diversity culture, which not only affects hiring, but affects how we respect and honor everyone in our organization by celebrating different cultures, and even putting inclusion in your corporate goals. We are going to hire this many people, and we're going to promote X amount of people that we hire, and we're going to mentor young Jonathan when he's starting on his business. Not just to hire, because so often we hire someone and it's a cold culture they're running into. So I encourage organizations to do a diversity and inclusion study and set some goals to change their ways.
Okay, we have a question. The individual did not want to come to the stage, but she's asked if I would ask the question. And that was to elaborate on the concept, Jonathan, that you mentioned earlier about white progressive privilege. If you guys could discuss that a little deeper.
Yeah, no, definitely. And Tom, I don't know if you want to give a more, elaborate with your perspective on it, but again, I find myself to be surrounded, and this is my own personal experience, I find myself to be surrounded around a lot of people that are white who I know are in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. I know that they are, in line with the things that need to change in society. But when it comes to really digging deep with them about why these things are, or maybe some, again, implicit perspectives on race that they have, they cut off the conversation. And if anything, they further express how they're not racist. They'll use proximity as a example of that. Well, my neighbor's Black, and we talk all the time. And again, I in these situations, I'm not saying that these people are not in line with some of the things that this country's going through right now. But ultimately, unless you're willing to really talk about it and put it out on the table and have a conversation about it, and not leapfrog it and say, well, we cut a check, we made some hires, my neighbor's Black, my best friend's Black. If you're not willing to take a deep dive into it, to me, that's that progressive white privilege.
One of the things I've noticed in the past few weeks is I'm getting a lot of people I know call or write and want to know what book to read. Like one book will make a difference, but one book won't make a difference at the same time. And they consider themselves progressive, but to take that step out is uncomfortable for them. I don't know if you can see this. My button says "White Lives Matter," and I can wear that out in public, and you can see people, just their reaction to it. They're either afraid of me or they want to start a conversation. But you've got to. It's like any other important issue, and I can't think of any issue in this country that's more important. We've got to step into it and take action.
Tom, you mentioned your button. We did have one guest here say that he felt you're needlessly offensive.
Thank you. I hear that. I hear that from a lot of people, and I would ask them. I would want to engage in a conversation with them as why they find it offensive. When I get comments like that, my first thought that goes through my mind is some pancakes can't be flipped. You can't I'm not looking for an argument. I'm looking for a discussion, and you can usually tell pretty fast whether someone wants to enter into a deep and honest discussion. But we should look at ways to do so, by asking them their thoughts and their input, and slowly try to build a relationship. It probably won't happen while you're passing someone with their card at Walmart. The typical place is Thanksgiving with your Uncle Charlie, to which I always say, eat at the kids' table. It's a lot more fun and you can eat with your fingers than having to deal with your drunk racist uncle. But yeah, people have to be prepared to interrupt racism. Blow a whistle, as a friend of mine used to say.
Yeah, and just a comment I have on the button. It's interesting. This past week, I was watching CNBC, which I watch a lot of, and Larry Kudlow, who's the economic advisor to the president, and to Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, was asked about his opinions on systemic racism in this country, and he explicitly said he doesn't think it exists. And the reporter asked him again, just to clarify that he understood the question. He said, "No, I heard the question, and I'm telling you, it doesn't exist." And in a way, obviously there are a lot of the feedback and comments where I can't believe he's saying that, but I appreciated he didn't lie about it, his own opinion of it, right? Because now you know where Larry Kudlow stands, and that's your starting point on how to build towards a better world, right? You know what angle of conversation you have to have with the Larry Kudlow versus him saying, "You know what, you're right, it's everywhere," and again going right back on Monday morning into a power position and making decisions that are the antithesis of that. Right.
I agree.
Okay, could we bring on Vic Drabicki? Vic Drabicki.
Hey guys, Alzu, good to see you, man. Hope you're doing well. Thank you for hosting this too. I got a question for you. So I run an advertising agency where just shy of 70 people or so, and I think the thing that we keep trying to answer for ourselves is, how do we know when we're diverse? Diversity is a really interesting thing. If we look at it from an African American perspective, we aren't at all diverse. If we look at it from an LGBTQ perspective, we actually appear to be very diverse. If we look at it on female versus male, we seem to have a good balance. So what we're trying to figure out is, how do we actually know when we're diverse? And putting in things like numbers to hit, or percent of the employees that are a certain race or ethnicity or sexual orientation, all seem kind of like the wrong goal. So that's one of the things we're trying to solve for. So any advice would be great.
I would ask the targeted people in your organization if they feel the company is diverse. It's not just how many LBGT people, or how many Black people, or how many Latino people we have. Is the organization doing things to promote diversity and cross-culture understanding in their organization? I would also suggest, and this goes back to the first question, there's something called the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. And if you want to wake yourself up, Larry Kudlow included, Google the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, and it'll show you where your biases are around race and gender and ability and multiple different areas that affect us. The last thing I want to say is, I read recently that around 2040, the majority of the people in the United States will not be white. They will be people of color, or, as I like to say, people of the global majority. Think of that phrase, and think how we're going to look in 40 years. And we need to prepare for that. It's not going to be you and I and Jonathan as our diverse person in the future. More and more people are going to look like Jonathan, are going to be running organizations and holding elective offices. And we have to accept that reality and prepare now.
Okay, thanks, Vic. Could we have Alex Varney come to the stage here?
Hi, can you hear me?
Hey, Alex.
Hey, so thanks so much. I've got my video off. I'll turn that on real quick. When you mentioned the GI Bill, speaking personally, I'm almost embarrassed to say I didn't know that it was so selective and it really only benefited white people. So to me, that seems like a super cut and dry example that one could use when talking to people to sort of point out, we talk about how the GI Bill helped build a generation, and if it really only built part of a generation, can't we look at that as an example of proof of white privilege? I'm interested if you're aware of any sort of common, ways of discrediting that point, or, kind of saying, oh, well, that was then, this is now. To me, it seems like a really compelling argument. I'm interested if you have any experience with ways people can kind of push it to the side. Thank you.
Interesting enough, my great-great-grandfather enslaved people, and I have met the descendant of one of those relationships. Nothing we're proud of, and we've often discussed how our lives, or our grandfathers and fathers, great-grandfathers, diversed over 125 years since that event, and whether it be our grandfather's lives or our father's lives or our own lives, there are just all of these differences, notable like the GI Bill, and not so notable about things like what school books your school system is getting. So it's all over the place. Go back and read history. Read about the GI Bill. It's just amazing. The other thing I like to talk about, I was 25 years old and I was working with a woman of Japanese descent, and she said her family was from California, and I said, well, how'd you get to St. Louis? And she said, well, after the camps closed, my parents came to St. Louis. And I said, oh, I went to Boy Scout camp every summer. Where did they go? And so at 25, I had never heard of internment camps before, and they're a major part of our history. So again, white lives matter. We're not teaching our history.
Okay, let's have Robert Rose come with his question.
Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Hi guys. Yeah, my name is Robert Rose. I don't know if you can see me that well, but I actually run a digital ad agency myself here out of New Haven, Connecticut. I worked in the workplace or the corporate environment for literally the last 20 years. My question, outside of the current state of what's been going on recently with, the unfortunate death of George Floyd and the protest, but this kind of topic that we're discussing about diversity and inclusion and, just more awareness in the workplace per se, I want to kind of piggyback off of one of the two questions I heard. One was around the sensitivity training, and the other was, I guess, the gentleman that asked about, how do you know when you're really diverse, right? So my specific question is, there is so many things out there, or there's so many organizations, or so many types of, there's things like, the CDP, you can become a certified diversity professional or certified diversity executive. So many Fortune 500 companies, they have existing, executives who are in charge of diversity, right? So where do we stand currently? What is kind of the current state of how we're doing with all these initiatives that were put in place over the last couple of years? And what have we learned from those things? Is there anyone that could provide any insight on those things? Are we doing better? Is it getting worse? Is it, kind of a status quo?
I don't have an immediate answer. Maybe Jonathan does. He's still working, but I'd be happy to do some research and get back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something clearly happening in this country, and I think there's a lot of organizations that have taken it upon themselves to try to sort through diversity and inclusion. The bigger the organization, honestly, the deeper the pockets and the bigger the risk. So they tend to sit maybe more in front of the line. And somebody brought up some of the major media companies that are requiring this. And I think that what we're seeing over the last couple of weeks is that you know, with the George Floyd and the protests is a sense of, and also when in Florida unemployment, you're having people, you know, file for unemployment that never in a million years thought they would be filing for unemployment. And some of those people undoubtedly thought that unemployment wasn't a thing that would impact their culture, right? And so there's a sense of, I think, of empathy that came down. And oftentimes racism in some people's eyes is it doesn't exist unless you actually see it, right? And we all saw an extreme example of it in Minnesota. And that therein brought the conversation to a head. And now you have a lot of different organizations saying that we're going to do things, we're going to put things in place, we're going to donate money. And so, and like you, I think I'm a little bit lost in the grocery store, if you will, of like all the different things that are out there that people are trying to do, but nothing's necessarily streamlined to where you can say, all right, these are the things that small business owners should do. These are the things that large business owners should do. But I think the one thing that's common is conversation to me, right? It's just talking about it and creating a comfortable environment for people to talk about it. And I should say comfortable because it's an uncomfortable conversation. But ultimately, I really do believe the more that we talk about it and the more that you can see it, recognize it, understand it, the more willingness you would have to bring it up, right? Because oftentimes as the minority, as I'm not sure if you can also share the same perspective with, it's hard for us to be the one to say, hold up, stop the conversation. We should all talk about this. I was at a meeting years ago, and we were discussing an artist, a hip hop artist, and I was the only Black at the table. I'm an executive at the time, and we were having the conversation about, you know, who should we get to take the meeting. You know, it came up in a very implicit way that I wasn't urban enough for the meeting, right? And you know, in my head, and I still think about that day till today. In my head, that meant you weren't Black enough. In my head, that meant, well, you're Black enough to potentially be pulled over and something bad happened to you, but you're not Black enough to have this meeting. And the person that said it, again, I don't think that they are a racist per se, but I think that, again, it goes back to that term that I used before, which was the progressive white privilege, to where you maybe see things, say things, believe things that you just don't actually understand that are racist. So if I would have had the support of the others at that table to bring it up and have that conversation, because the company had set up an environment to where we could talk about these things openly, it'd have been a lot easier to say, hey, hold up, let's just talk about that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's happened in the past few weeks is this awareness amongst white people, you know, not only with the shootings and the murders, but with the COVID virus. You know, in St. Louis, the higher percentage of African Americans are affected by COVID by white people. And there are a number of factors, whether it be where the hospitals and doctors are and the transportation system to get there, and who is having to go back to work and who isn't. And it's greatly affecting, and it's all things we just it's so easy to let it go right by us and not pay attention to it. One of the things I get asked all the time is, I don't have any Black friends. Who can I talk to? And, you know, that's your fault if you don't. It's not the response. But Black people have been training us now for 400 years, you know, and it's not African Americans' responsibility to teach us about racism, because we created racism. And it's time for us to go out and be able to learn about it and talk about it comfortably. I always say, next time you're in a coffee shop and you see a guy reading, an African person reading a book, just say, hey, what book are you reading? And they might engage you and they may not. They're not, it's not going to go beyond that. So just begin to take some risk of getting out there and meeting and talking to people.
Okay, let's bring on Elizabeth Myers, please. Elizabeth.
Hi. I appreciated, Jonathan, your comment of the progressive white privilege. I think for me, I've been seeing more of how I can be that way without even realizing it, and and being able to just make sure that I then like change my mind. I feel like it's a lot of it is changing my perspective, changing my mind, and being able to change the way that I see. And so I guess my question is like, do you feel like education is one of like the best ways to be able to like overcome this progressive white privilege that you were talking about? Is it the conversation like you mentioned before? Is it a combination of the two? And so yes, I guess that's my question is like, is education like one of the best ways to do it, as well as in conversations with people, all people, not just people that are African American?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, like I said before, I think the conversation is important, but also education, and I think Tom can maybe even speak to this, that things like the GI Bill, things like redlining, Jim Crow laws. We've heard Jim Crow law, Juneteenth, right? If I had, today's my 10-year anniversary, and so I was married on Juneteenth, and I remember when we selected that day, I knew what that day was. And you'd be surprised. I mean, the amount of people that didn't know what that day was. It just, to me, in my head, automatically I knew the significance of that day. So the education part is super important, because you have, in order to know where you're going, you have to know where we all came from. Without that, it's hard to really kind of move forward. I mean, maybe Tom, one of my favorite stories is, the one that I've heard you talk about, why you got into this field of work after attending a baseball game. So I don't know if you want to talk about that. Right.
My first acknowledgement that there were people other than white people in the world was in spring of 1955. Here in St. Louis, my grandfather took me to a baseball game, and it was the then Brooklyn Dodgers. For those of you that don't know, the Dodgers started in Brooklyn, versus the St. Louis Cardinals. And I can remember my grandfather asking me, what do I see in the right field bleachers? Well, what I saw was a couple hundred black faces. And up until that point, I had no recollection or no knowledge that there were people other than looked like me. Well, they were there because Jackie Robinson was playing. But St. Louis had a segregated stadium at the time, and little things like that over my lifetime raised my awareness. I want to talk about education, and in this case, formal education. I used to do some youth leadership work in some urban schools, and I just happened to pick up their American history book, and there was maybe 2 paragraphs about the Black experience from the colonial times through the Civil War. And I said to the teacher, do you like this school book? And she said, oh yeah, it's very good. One of the private schools donated it to us. So if it's good enough for the private school, I won't name the school, Jonathan. It's good enough for our kids. And, so we have to go back and look at our formal education. What history are we teaching? What are we teaching about science? What is the impact of people of color on our culture, musically, educationally, sports-wise, whatever? And if we're still using school books that came from the good school, and now there's 2 and 3 generations used, we're making a horrible mistake, and we're denying our history, and we're denying what we're really capable of being in this country.
All right, let's bring on Steve Singer, please. Steve,
hey,
welcome.
Hope you can hear me. Thanks for doing this. This is pretty fascinating and important. I've got an observation and a question. So my observation of what's been going on goes beyond powerful and all this, but I think it's because it seems to be this organic movement, which is a good thing, and I think that's part of why it has a lot of traction. My question is based on my fear of America as a whole, which has a short memory span. If you look ahead 6 months to a year from now, where do you see this? Does it need some kind of, bigger organized entity to kind of manage this? I guess that's kind of my.
As it relates, it's interesting as it relates to entertainment. Because I've actually was recently just having this conversation with somebody yesterday of how do you hold companies accountable for the things they say they're going to do, right? We've seen what happens, and again, this is a very extreme example, but you see what happens when police themselves. So when organizations say, well, we're going to do these things to help make our four walls and therefore our industry and therefore the world a better place, and they don't do those things, where's the accountability? And it's a good question, especially the smaller the company, the more privately held the company, the less risk in having to have a fallout because you don't do these things. The only things I can think about as a business owner, and Tom would love your thoughts, is, when you think about your clients, right? Those that choose to have you, either service or sell goods to them, that they will make decisions on whether or not they still want to do business with a company like that says they do things and do not do them. And at an executive level, especially for bigger companies, I think there should be some sort of type of tie to compensation. Because in my head, I can't come up with why somebody that, especially an older executive that's towards retirement, really wants to put things in place and make change when they're on a sunset. So I struggle with that as well.
How do you like this idea? What if in your written goals, and for people who have written goals, or write some for yourself, or you're employed and hopefully you have written goals, something about inclusion and diversity is written in those goals and it's tied to your compensation. I'm having trouble thinking specifically what, but you will, whether it's who you call on for your clients or participating in sensitivity training. But if the person in your if you expect a salesperson to sell $2 million a year and they get a bonus, why not say, all right, we expect you to sell $2 million a year and participate in these programs and prove to us that you're a part of this inclusive community, and that will affect your compensation.
All right, folks, we're down to about 15 minutes left. So we're going to only be able to take 3 more questions. We have Paul Sweeting, then Ellie McNeil, and then Lonray Edawu will be our last question. So let's bring Paul.
Thanks, Ned. Hey, Jonathan, Tom. I wanted to get back, follow up on this question of education and the sort of invisibility of white privilege and institutional white privilege to white people. There's been discussion here earlier, people not being aware that the GI Bill largely excluded Black people until 1968 and the passage of the Federal Housing Act. Blacks were essentially excluded from federally backed home loans. Large swaths of the New Deal programs that progressives like to hail effectively excluded African Americans, and but even progressive whites in this country sort of don't see that. Those are not naturally, the Fair Housing Act, sort of addressed the problem of wealth creation in the African American community. I mean, a big part of wealth creation among the middle class in this country is housing wealth, and Blacks were systematically excluded from that. And that wasn't banks redlining neighborhoods; that was the federal government making those decisions, or at least enforcing that implicit bias. And it's the same thing with after World War II, this country spent a lot of federal resources building the interstate system and a transit system that enabled white flight out of cities into redlined suburban neighborhoods. We don't think about that. We don't, a lot of the consequences of that are regarded by even progressive white people as sort of naturally occurring phenomenon, when they're not. They were political decisions that we as a society made. to benefit some and not benefit others. So my question is, we're at this sort of unique, at least in recent years, unique moment in this country with the Black Lives Matter protests and so forth. Is there a way we can use this moment to make that kind of white privilege less invisible to white people?
Again, I think it's through study and discussion, and look at your community. Here in St. Louis, we have Highway 6440 that runs through the middle of the county and through the middle of the city. And it moves people downtown and back out to the suburbs as fast as it can be. But to build that highway, they destroyed an entire African-American community. And those things exist everywhere. So just begin to study your history and I was biking one day out in the county, and I came across a road sign that called Old Slave Road. Now, how can that sign exist there for over 150 years and no one not say anything about it? So again, it's this awareness and mindfulness of what's going on that we have to continue for ourselves and our children and even Uncle Charlie.
Okay, let's bring on Ellie McNeil, please.
Hey, gentlemen. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation today. Really appreciate everything that you guys are sharing with us. I have a question, which is about how to foster that environment to have this discussion, as you mentioned, Jonathan, between the four walls first, before necessarily jumping towards something more public as a company. I don't know if anyone else here has had a similar experience, but I did learn through a lot of the movement here that it's not necessarily putting our name out there behind Blackout Tuesday and behind some of this movement that's happening may actually not be, could be perceived as self-serving, and not necessarily substantive in the change that it might make. So we've been focusing on having internal discussions, but that's difficult because when you have an internal discussion about a complicated problem, there can be differences in opinion, which they may be popular and then unpopular, specifically when it comes to the political side of, what type of political action should come out of this. So I'm just wondering what you guys have as far as tips for encouraging that open space and how to continue the process of having this very important conversation amongst our team members to make real change.
My quick answer is if you can get your C-level people, C-level executives involved and committed, that is a major step forward. When they incorporate it into the company culture. Now, getting them to do that might be a challenge, and if they don't, then maybe it can start in a lunchroom conversation. But we've got to step out of it, and for all the unfortunate things that have happened in the last few weeks, we're fortunate that people are discussing this.
And also, I think too, starting with, especially the smaller organizations, is a little easier, but starting with sharing who you are with your colleagues, like instead of them just seeing you as director of, VP of, or coordinator of, who you are, who are your parents, where were you raised, what was your environment like, and not saying that first conversation is going to be a floodgate, but as those conversations happen, they build and they get more interesting, and more importantly, people get more comfortable, which is that's one of the biggest hurdles is, I'm uncomfortable, I'm going to leave. I'm uncomfortable, I'm going to shut the conversation down. I'm uncomfortable, I'm going to re-justify how you're not talking about me because that can't be me because et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. There's nothing wrong with a little uncomfort.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Lonray, please turn on Lonray's mic.
Right. Hello, everybody. Thank you guys for this. And I just want to give kudos and props to everybody for joining this call, because the fact that you're even on this call means that you care to a large degree. And I think that's one of the biggest solutions to the issue is, number one, caring, right? So if you care, you're here. If you care, hopefully you're doing something about it, and you're wanting to learn and educate yourself. My specific question is for the panelists: do you agree with the thought or the theory that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem?
As Bob Dylan said 50 or 60 years ago, if you're, well, get out of the road is basically what he said. Get out of the way. You're not a part of the solution. Get out of the way. So yeah, it just permeates our society in so many ways that if you're not aware and begin to become part of the solution, yeah, I think you're part of the problem. You're just a lump sitting there.
Yeah, just to good people can still perpetuate bad systems.
Right. And I apologize to Bob Dylan for screwing up his lyrics.
All right, that's it for our questions, and I think Jonathan and Tom, I'd love to have you guys just kind of give us your closing thoughts. I have one of my own that I'd like to just express. We've been having these discussions at our law firm at Phelps and Phillips. One of the things that we've really, closed in on in terms of an area where we think we can help make a difference is focusing on ensuring that everyone has the right to vote. So we're going to be undertaking that effort in a big way in all the cities where we have offices, and be talking more about those in the future. But Jonathan and Tom would love to kind of hear your closing thoughts, and we have a few minutes left to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate. I agree. Like Landry was saying, that the fact that you're here today shows that you're willing to take clear and actionable steps towards making it a better world. And so I appreciate everybody that's joined this call. I appreciate DMW for giving us the platform, and then definitely Tom Schweizer for giving us some of his knowledge and insight on how we can all collectively work towards improving and opening this conversation, this important conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan, for those kind words. And I just encourage people to go educate yourself, broaden your horizons, be prepared to be a little uncomfortable. You were uncomfortable once before somewhere, and you survived. In fact, if you're 38 years old, you've survived to 38 with some degree of uncomfort. And just get out there and do it. But be prepared for some failures and mistakes. But two steps forward, one step back, you're still a step ahead.
Jonathan, thank you again for leading this discussion and bringing Tom into the discussion today. To everybody who joined, we really appreciate your and your involvement. And this will not be the last discussion like this. We will continue to do this. I think we're kind of looking at bi-weekly, at the moment, but we also would love to hear from you, hear your ideas and solutions. I think, we need to take conversation and start moving that into solutions. So thank you, everybody. Thanks again, Jonathan. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.